When real gangsters start respecting you, you know you've done something right, or something very, very wrong. James Cagney wasn't a criminal, but mobsters treated him like one of their own. Why? Because he played the part too well. Maybe too well. From vaudeville to the big screen. James Cagney didn't set out to be Hollywood's ultimate tough guy. Born in 1899 in New York City, he grew up on the rough streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side, where real gangsters ran the show. But he wasn't running with them. He was too busy dancing. His mother, Carolyn, pushed him into show business, hoping it would keep him out of trouble. It worked. By his early 20s, he was making a name for himself in vaudeville, where he perfected his stage presence. He had no formal acting training, but he didn't need it. Quick-witted, expressive, and bursting with energy, he could steal a scene with a single movement. His early gigs weren't glamorous. He worked as a chorus boy and even played a woman in one of his first stage roles. But no matter the part, he had presence. Audiences noticed, directors noticed, and soon Hollywood did too. By 1930, he landed his first film role in Sinner's Holiday, a low-budget crime drama. He wasn't the lead, but his performance made him impossible to ignore. Warner Brothers executives saw something different in him, an edge, a rawness other actors couldn't fake. They signed him under contract, and suddenly he was in the studio's fast lane. Then came The Public Enemy, 1931, the film that turned him into a star. Originally cast as the supporting character, he impressed the director so much in the first few days of filming that they rewrote the production plan. Cagney became the lead. That decision changed Hollywood history. His portrayal of Tom Powers was something audiences had never seen before. Gangsters had been played on screen, but never like this. He wasn't just a thug. He was charming, almost likable, until he wasn't. That unpredictability made him terrifying. And then there was that scene. The infamous grapefruit to the face moment wasn't in the script. It was an improvisation, a last-minute decision that became one of the most iconic moments in film history. Audiences were hooked, critics raved. But what really got people talking? The fact that real criminals recognized themselves in his performance. Word spread fast. Mobsters weren't just watching Cagney's movies, they were studying him. Some even started mimicking his mannerisms. That's when things got interesting. When mobsters wanted to meet him. By the mid-1930s, James Cagney was Hollywood's undisputed king of gangster films. His performances weren't just convincing, they were unnervingly real. He wasn't the first actor to play a criminal, but no one did it quite like him. It wasn't about looking tough, it was how he moved, how he carried himself, and how he could flip from charming to ruthless in an instant. His gangsters weren't caricatures, they felt dangerous. Audiences couldn't get enough, and neither could real criminals. It wasn't long before Cagney started hearing stories. Mobsters liked his performances. They saw themselves in his characters. Some even copied his mannerisms. The way he tilted his hat, the way he delivered threats with an almost playful tone. It wasn't just good acting, it was familiar. That admiration wasn't just talk. According to Hollywood legend, notorious mobsters wanted to meet him. They saw Cagney as one of their own, and they wanted to bring him into their world, not as an actor, but as an honorary tough guy. Private clubs, exclusive dinners, business meetings. He got plenty of invitations. Cagney wanted nothing to do with any of it. He wasn't interested in rubbing elbows with criminals, but the fact that they wanted his approval? That said everything about how convincing he was. One of the most famous encounters happened in Chicago. Cagney was out at a club when a group of sharply dressed men approached his table. These weren't just fans, they were mobsters. One of them reportedly leaned in and said, "Jimmy, you do us better than we do ourselves." That was not the kind of compliment Cagney wanted. He stayed polite, cracked a joke, and made it clear he wasn't looking for new friends. But after that, he started taking precautions. The invitations kept coming, and he wasn't about to take any chances. He hired a bodyguard. Warner Brothers executives got nervous. If real gangsters were this interested in their biggest star, it wasn't just a safety issue, it was bad for business. The tough guy. Warner Brothers had a formula: cast James Cagney as a gangster, make money, repeat. It worked. Audiences loved him, and the studio saw no reason to change. But Cagney wasn't just another contract player. He had ambition, range, and zero patience for being boxed in. By the late 1930s, he was tired of playing the same character over and over. He wanted variety, and more importantly, he wanted control over his own career. That wasn't how Hollywood worked. The studio system had actors locked into restrictive contracts that gave them little say over their roles. Warner Brothers treated Cagney like a reliable product, not an artist. He disagreed, loudly. In 1936, he did something almost unthinkable at the time. He sued Warner Brothers, arguing that they were violating labor laws and unfairly limiting his opportunities. Studios didn't lose lawsuits. Actors who challenged them usually got blacklisted or buried in minor roles until their careers fizzled out. Cagney didn't care. He took them to court and won. He walked away from Warner Brothers with his contract nullified, proving that even in Hollywood, he wouldn't be pushed around. With his newfound freedom, he started picking roles that he wanted. He took a break from playing criminals and explored different genres, starring in comedies and even musicals. It was a gamble, but it paid off in a big way. In 1942, he starred in Yankee Doodle Dandy, a musical biography of Broadway legend George M. Cohan. It was about as far from a gangster film as possible. He sang, he danced, he played a patriotic hero, and he won an Oscar for it. That was the moment Cagney proved he wasn't just the best at playing tough guys. He was one of the best actors of his generation, period. He could do anything. The role that redefined fear. By the late 1940s, James Cagney had distanced himself from gangster films, proving he could do more than just play criminals. He had danced his way to an Oscar in Yankee Doodle Dandy, 1942, starred in comedies, and even dabbled in war films. But when he returned to the crime genre in 1949 with White Heat, he wasn't just playing another tough guy, he was creating something new. Cody Jarrett wasn't the smooth, calculated gangsters Cagney had played before. He was unhinged, a violent, unpredictable psychopath with a mother fixation and a brutal streak that made previous crime bosses look tame. There was no code of honor, no quiet intelligence, just raw, unchecked rage. He was dangerous in a way Hollywood hadn't seen before. Cagney leaned into that instability. His Cody Jarrett didn't just kill for power. He killed because he enjoyed it. He lashed out without warning, his temper constantly bubbling under the surface. One second he was laughing with his gang, the next he was gunning someone down in cold blood. The audience never knew what he would do next, and that unpredictability made him terrifying. One of the film's most disturbing moments happens inside a prison cafeteria. Jarrett, already volatile, learns of his mother's death. In an instant, he loses all control, shrieking in agony as he attacks guards, thrashing like a wounded animal. That scene wasn't in the original script, not like that. Cagney improvised, making the grief feel real. It wasn't just an actor playing a criminal, it was something darker. Then came the ending. Jarrett, cornered by the cops, doesn't go out quietly. Instead, he scrambles to the top of a massive gas tank, bullets flying around him. With nowhere to run, he grins and shouts, "Made it, Ma! Top of the world!" before setting off an explosion that engulfs him in flames. The film was an instant classic. Critics called Cagney's performance one of the greatest in crime film history. Decades later, White Heat is still studied, still quoted, still celebrated. With Cody Jarrett, Cagney had done more than return to gangster films. He had changed them forever. The line he never said. James Cagney's name became synonymous with Hollywood gangsters, but there was one problem. Everyone kept quoting a line he never actually said. "You dirty rat." It became his unofficial catchphrase, something comedians and impersonators repeated for decades. Even Bugs Bunny got in on the act, mimicking Cagney's voice in Looney Tunes skits. Nightclub performers built entire routines around it. The line popped up in sitcoms, stand-up comedy, and pop culture references for years. The problem: Cagney never said it. The closest he ever came was in Blonde Crazy, 1931, when he snarled, "That dirty double-crossing rat." Somehow the words morphed into the famous misquote, and it spread like wildfire. At first, he laughed it off. It wasn't the worst thing to be remembered for. After all, it kept him relevant in pop culture. But after years of hearing it shouted at him on the street, he got tired of correcting people. "I never said it. Not once. Never," he'd insist in interviews. But it didn't matter. The myth was stronger than the truth. It wasn't just the line that followed him. It was the whole tough guy image. The public loved Gangster Cagney. No matter how many musicals, comedies, or serious dramas he did, people still saw him as the fast-talking, trigger-happy crime boss from The Public Enemy and White Heat. He could be tap dancing in Yankee Doodle Dandy, and someone in the crowd would still yell, "Hey, you dirty rat!" Even his own family couldn't escape it. His wife, Frances Cagney, once recalled that a hotel clerk greeted them with an exaggerated gangster accent. "Ah, Mr. Cagney, right this way!" It never stopped. When the FBI came knocking. By the 1940s, James Cagney was untouchable in Hollywood. He'd spent over a decade redefining tough guy roles, proving himself beyond just crime films, and even snagging an Oscar for Yankee Doodle Dandy, 1942. But in the middle of World War II, he found himself in the crosshairs, not of rival studios or critics, but of the U.S. government. In an era where being suspected of communist ties was enough to ruin a career, Cagney's name landed on an FBI watch list. His crime? Supporting workers' rights and backing President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. It was hardly controversial at the time. FDR had overwhelming public support. But as political tensions rose, so did paranoia. Cagney had been involved in organizing actors' unions and advocating for fair wages, something that didn't sit well with Hollywood's elite. Some studio heads despised unions and were quick to label any labor activist as a leftist threat. The whispers started. A few anonymous accusations turned into official inquiries. Before he knew it, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had his name on their radar. At the height of his career, he was suddenly forced to defend himself against claims that could have ended everything. Unlike many of his peers, Cagney didn't panic. He didn't flee the country. He didn't hide. He went straight to the source and voluntarily testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, the government's feared anti-communist task force. With his usual confidence, he faced down the accusations head-on. He denied any communist affiliations, called the rumors baseless, and made it clear that he had never supported any anti-American movements. The committee had nothing on him. They had no evidence, no credible witnesses, just speculation. Cagney walked out of the hearing with his reputation intact. Others weren't so lucky. Many actors, writers, and directors found themselves blacklisted, their careers destroyed overnight. Cagney, once again, refused to be a pawn in anyone else's game. He went straight back to work, starring in White Heat, 1949, one of his greatest performances. But behind the scenes, he wasn't just thinking about his next film. He was thinking about leaving Hollywood altogether. The industry had changed, and for the first time, he was wondering if it was time to step away for good. When he called it quits. By the early 1950s, James Cagney had done it all. He wasn't just one of Hollywood's biggest stars. He had outlasted trends, outsmarted studio executives, and outperformed actors half his age. He played gangsters, heroes, dancers, and politicians. He won an Oscar. He took Warner Brothers to court and won. He helped shape the very foundation of crime films. If there was a Hollywood checklist for career achievements, Cagney had checked every box. But the grind was wearing on him. The scripts weren't exciting anymore. The golden age of gangster films was over, and while he still had offers, they felt uninspired. The idea of playing the same tough guys over and over didn't sit right. He didn't want to be a relic of a past era, repeating himself just to cash a paycheck. In 1961, after starring in Billy Wilder's 1, 2, 3, he made a decision most actors would never dream of. He quit. No grand farewell, no drawn-out retirement tour. He simply walked away. Hollywood didn't believe it at first. Retiring at 62? At the height of his talent? Impossible. But Cagney wasn't bluffing. He moved to a farm in upstate New York, far away from the noise of the industry. He wasn't just stepping back, he was completely removing himself from the world of film. No interviews, no special appearances. He spent his days painting, writing, and riding horses. For years, he refused every offer to return. Directors called, studios begged. He ignored them all. He had no interest in looking back. "Why keep going when you've done everything you wanted to do?" he once said. To him, the idea of dragging out his career was pointless. He didn't need the money. He didn't need the validation. He was done. The comeback. James Cagney had nothing left to prove. By the early 1960s, he had done it all. Won an Oscar, fought the studios and won, redefined the gangster genre, and left Hollywood on his own terms. He walked away without regrets, trading the film set for a quiet life on his farm in upstate New York. While others faded into irrelevance or chased after their past glory, he stayed out of the spotlight. He turned down scripts, ignored studio calls, and avoided the nostalgia circuit. As far as he was concerned, his time in Hollywood was over. Then, in 1981, everything changed. Director Milos Forman, best known for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was making Ragtime, a historical drama set in early 20th century America. He wanted Cagney for the role of New York Police Commissioner Rhinelander Waldo, a man as corrupt as the criminals he claimed to fight. Forman was persistent. He knew that if anyone could bring quiet menace to the role, it was Cagney. There was just one problem. Cagney had been retired for 2 decades. He was in his 80s, dealing with severe arthritis and struggling with memory loss. Learning lines was no longer easy. Acting, something that had once come naturally, was now a challenge. Still, the idea intrigued him. He had always believed in leaving on a high note, and Ragtime wasn't just any film. It was an ensemble drama featuring a mix of old legends and rising stars. If he was going to step in front of the camera one last time, this was the film to do it. When Cagney finally agreed, Hollywood took notice. His return was treated like an event, proof that the old legends still had power. The role was small, but his screen time was electric. Even at 81, slowed by age, his presence commanded attention. He didn't need to shout, move fast, or dominate a scene. Just standing there, he exuded authority. Critics raved about his performance. Ragtime earned multiple Oscar nominations, and Cagney's return was hailed as one of the film's biggest highlights. Offers poured in for more roles, but he turned them all down. One comeback was enough. This time he retired for good, on his own terms, just the way he liked it. Legend that scared real criminals. James Cagney spent decades proving he was more than just a Hollywood gangster. He sang, he danced, he played war heroes and businessmen. He won an Oscar for a musical, for crying out loud. But despite his efforts to break free from the tough guy image, one thing always followed him. He was the actor who made crime look real. Long after his last gangster role, people were still talking about how actual mobsters respected him. Not in the way they admired someone playing dress-up, but in a way that suggested they saw him as one of their own. They weren't fans, they were believers. Cagney's performances weren't just convincing, they were accurate. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he could go from calm to explosive in a second. It wasn't something that could be faked. Real criminals picked up on it. One of the most famous stories came from an encounter with a group of Chicago gangsters. They weren't looking to threaten him or shake him down. They wanted to thank him. They appreciated that he got it right. He wasn't playing a caricature. He wasn't hamming it up. He embodied something that felt real to them. According to legend, one even told him, "You do us better than we do ourselves." That level of authenticity wasn't just about Cagney's ability to act. It was about his understanding of power, control, and unpredictability, things real criminals lived by. But Cagney wasn't interested in glorifying crime. He never wanted to make gangsters look like heroes. His characters always had a downfall. He made sure of it. And in real life, he had no patience for actual criminals. He turned down invitations to meet with mobsters. He stayed out of their world, no matter how much they admired him. Gangster king of classic Hollywood. James Cagney never wanted to be a Hollywood legend. He never chased fame, never bought into the industry's glitz, and never played the game the way studios wanted him to. Yet by the time he was done, he had cemented himself as one of the most influential actors of all time. His impact stretched far beyond his era. Decades after his last major role, his films were still studied, referenced, and imitated. The Kennedy Center honored him for his contributions to American culture, recognizing his influence not just as a performer but as a defining force in cinema. His movies, especially his gangster films, became cultural touchstones, preserved by the National Film Registry as vital pieces of American film history. And then there were the actors who followed in his footsteps. Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Jack Nicholson, even Martin Scorsese, each credited Cagney as an inspiration. His ability to bring depth and unpredictability to criminals paved the way for every gangster film that came after him. Without Cagney, there's no Scarface, no Goodfellas, no The Godfather. He showed that a villain didn't have to be one note, that they could be layered, intense, even sympathetic. But if you asked him what mattered most, he wouldn't have pointed to the awards or the industry recognition. He never cared about being the most famous, the richest, or the most decorated. His real pride came from something else, his independence. In 1986, Cagney passed away at the age of 86. His career spanned over 5 decades, but his legacy never faded. Whether he liked it or not, he will always be remembered as the man who played criminals so well that even real criminals had to give him credit.